When asked what makes someone Indian, the love for chai is usually among the top answers. Hence, it comes as a surprise to most Indians that their taste for tea isn't some centuries-old inherent Indian trait, but an unexpected consequence of major political events involving several nations. In this video, I'm going to tell you why your pyala of chai has a lot to do with the current situation in Hong Kong, the American Revolution, history's largest drug trafficking racket, and the Chinese distrust of Indians. It's hard to pick a specific starting point, but let's go with 1662, the year the Portuguese princess Catherine of Braganza married the English King Charles II. In her dowry, she brought the island of Bombay and a chest of tea. The tea she brought was not Indian tea, but Chinese. India had yet to discover the art of tea, but in China, a sophisticated tea drinking culture had thrived for over a millennia. It didn't take long for tea to become popular among the English. Soon the demand was so great that it created a massive trade imbalance with China, which was not interested in buying any British goods, and hence had to be paid in gold and silver. Concerns began to rise that Britain's taste for tea was well on its way to bankrupting the entire nation. A solution came from Bengal. After annexing this highly prosperous province of India in 1764, the British East India Company got control of the local opium industry. Turning Chinese people into opium users offered a way to ensure a steady Chinese demand. But importation of opium was illegal in China, so the company devised an elaborate trading scheme whereby British merchants carrying no opium would buy tea on credit in Guangzhou and then settle off their debt by selling opium at auctions in Calcutta, from where the opium would reach the Chinese coast aboard British ships and then be smuggled into the mainland by local merchants. As the opium trade grew, the Bengali farmers were coerced into growing more opium instead of rice and vegetables. If they refused, they were often kidnapped and threatened. Within a few years, the whole agricultural pattern collapsed. Unsurprisingly, a partial crop failure in 1770 resulted in a ghastly famine, causing acute food shortage. To ensure its profits were not impacted, the company further raised the taxes, multiplying the misery of the starving population. By 1772, 10 million people, or a third of Bengal's population, had died. With Bengal utterly destroyed, the revenues of the company collapsed. To bail it out, the British Parliament passed the Tea Act, granting it monopoly over Britain's American colonies, which at the time were booming markets for tea. This further angered the American patriots, who were already fed up of British control over their domestic affairs. In December 1773, they dumped the East India Company tea into the Boston Harbor, after which events quickly escalated, leading to what would then become the American War of Independence. Meanwhile, millions of Chinese went on getting addicted to opium, causing dramatic social upheaval in the Chinese society, impacting even the imperial troops and the official classes. By 19th century, Britain was smuggling over 1,000 tons of Bengali opium into China and had successfully turned the trade deficit into a surplus. In 1838, the Chinese finally acted. They confiscated 20,000 chests of opium brought by British traders and burnt them, a process which took 23 days. To extract revenge, the British sent forces from India, which plundered and looted the Chinese coast. In fact, it was at this time that the Indian word loot entered the English language. The Chinese saw British troops filled with Indian soldiers ravaging their temples, raping their women, and mercilessly killing innocent men and children. This permanently soured their perception of Indians, whom they called Zhao Gao, or running dogs of the British. Even today, whenever China-India conflicts resurface, slogans of Zhao Gao appear in the Chinese propaganda. The war ended in immense destruction and a humiliating defeat for China, forcing it to cede its territory of Hong Kong to Britain, which remained under British control until 1997. Over the subsequent decades, the opium trade went on growing. By the turn of 20th century, Britain had become the largest drug dealer the world had ever known, and China had developed the biggest drug problem experienced by any nation ever. In 1906, a quarter of male population in China was addicted to opium. While the Opium Wars continued, British worried that a trade disruption with China could impact their tea supply. In order to circumvent their dependence on China, they plotted to plant Chinese tea in India. Scottish botanist Robert Fortune was sent to China on a false pretext. After spending 3 years there learning the secrets of Chinese tea making, he managed to steal a large number of Chinese tea plants out of China. These were then brought to India and planted in Darjeeling, using Chinese cultivation techniques with trained workers who also came from China, ultimately leading to what would become the famous Darjeeling tea. Now here's the fun part. When the stolen plant was brought to India, Indians immediately recognized it as a variant of a native variety which grew in the wild. The local Singpho people of Assam had been consuming its brew for centuries. It was this native variety which was later planted at a large scale that went on to become the famous Assam tea. To popularize Indian tea, the British deployed a combination of ingenious marketing and deliberate misinformation. Advertisements flourished in Victorian London claiming that Indian tea was strong and manly, while the Chinese tea was weak and effeminate, or that Indian tea was pure while the Chinese tea was adulterated. By the end of 19th century, Indian tea had supplanted Chinese tea, not just in the British market, but almost everywhere in the world. However, Indians themselves kept their distance and remained suspicious of what they viewed as an imperialist product. The British were determined to change this. In their aggressive promotional campaign, they depicted tea drinking as modern and cultured. Tea stalls were erected throughout the growing railway system, and that's how the iconic chaiwalas with their stoves and kettles became a common feature of Indian train journeys. Interestingly, from the very beginning, these chaiwalas began to put their own spin by adding ginger and spices and greatly increasing the proportions of milk and sugar, departing from the way British make tea. Alas, despite the campaigning, tea drinking in India remained abysmally low. It was only after the independence, when tea plantations changed hands and chai began to be marketed as an entirely Swadeshi product, that tea drinking truly took off among India's middle classes and villages across the country. In my view, although India's first tea plantations were conceived by the British and cultivated using techniques that were Chinese, the chai we drink today, cooked, milky, sweet, with ginger and spices, is uniquely Indian.